Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Redpill, joined as always by Dr. Benway, and we're going to be discussing Robert Hughes. Now, Robert Hughes is an interesting fellow, and Dr. Benway, why don't you take it away and give us the presses on the man?
You always give me the hard work. Robert Hughes was an art critic for the New York Times. Well, that as blunt a statement as that is, let me give you some extra background. Gentleman was an Australian, born in the 30s, was from that sort of clique of Australians who, in that post-war period, started getting a sense of, well, we're kind of outside the typical world Western culture, but we feel we have the confidence and relevance to be a part of it. He was one of a small coterie of people in that kind of crowd, worked their way to the United States, and it was kind of impressive by, one, the quality of his writing. Two, I mean, he was just an enjoyable person to read and very quick of wit in his writing. But two, I think what you get from an art critic like him, which you wouldn't necessarily get from a art critic who just follows trends and is a slave to trends, is you have someone who has full historic appreciation of the traditions that precede his moment in time. And what you kind of get from reading him, from watching him, so on and so forth, you get a sense of a person who is well enough aware that he's on the, shall we say, dying embers of the last creative explosion. And I think he was probably convinced that within the rest of his lifetime, he wasn't going to see a mass movement of creativity that you would have gotten out of, let's say, the early modernist period.
Yeah. He was interesting, it seems to me, because he was, to give a little background, okay, the guy was really from a pretty elevated social circles in Australia. He moved in like the best circles, as they say. And in Wikipedia, it's quite funny. The listing says at university he associated with the Sydney Push, a group of artists, writers, intellectuals, and drinkers.
What's funny with that group is because I knew he was in that clique. I didn't know the name, but I'm like, okay, he's of the crowd that would have included Clive James and Germaine Greer. And then I looked at the Wikipedia article to see if they commented on it. And those are literally the other examples that they gave. So I just mentally knew what this guy was. And Clive James, I'm still shocked he's still alive, but he's still in England doing his thing. But there was this little coterie of these highly educated, I think they were mostly from Sydney, if not all of them are from Sydney, who eventually make their voyage right from the edges of the empire to the center of the empire, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, they float to England, to London, and they're part of the swinging '60s London set. You know, they're of that age. Because Robert Hughes was born in '38, and he's in the thick of things in London. And what's interesting is, to me, about his career is that, he, by pedigree and by background, he could have associated with the very, how can I put it, sort of almost esoteric set, the best people, if you will. He was a great writer, and he could have had a career of sort of like, I can't think of somebody offhand, but he could have had like a sort of like a high flying kind of career, or wound up in publishing. But instead, he deliberately chose to be the art critic for Time magazine, which at the time was not considered the bastion of high culture. But he decided to do that, and he elevated Time magazine indisputably. And his art criticism, I mean, how can I put it? He brought modern art to the masses by way of Time magazine and the way he approached art. And the very fact that he was so enthusiastic about his appreciations of art. He either hated something or loved it, but he gave exceptionally good reasons for either opinion. And so it was, black or white, but you always knew why. You always knew where you stood with the man.
There's a clear reason in my mind of why he had that. People may dispute me, but I think it's clearly a result of his Jesuit education. The school he went to while in Australia was an Ignatius school. I forget the exact name, but it's one of the Jesuit schools that the Catholic Church is very fond of creating. And I guarantee you, the rigor of the knowledge of all of these pieces of history that came readily to mind, and his ability to make his case and to be exacting, and more importantly, to have actual judgment in what he's saying, absolutely, in my mind, could not have happened outside of that Jesuit education. Let me put it this way: it could have, but you would have needed some simulacrum of it in order to get there.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that he became known for, I mean, one of the pillars of his career was The Fatal Shore. I read it quite a number of years ago. Unfortunately, I was not able to get a copy of it here for this conversation. But from what I recall of the book, it was massive. It was beautifully written. I mean, it's just the writing. It just sings practically. You never feel at any moment that your eye is tripping over itself, or you have to reread a sentence or something like that. You know, which I think is a combination of both his very good writing style, and also I think that for all the crap that Time magazine got stylistically, because a lot of people mocked the Time style, right? Who was it? Somebody clever used to mock it and did a parody of Time style, but precisely because of Time style, because Time was at the time trying to reach a mass audience. The Fatal Shore is erudite, precise, yet easy to read. It's easy to digest. You don't feel that, it's like this big thing that I'm going to have to slog through. It's a little bit, and I know you're going to hit me for this. It's a little bit like J.K. Rowling. You know, J.K. Rowling would hit you with a doorstopper of a book, but it was fun to read. You know, and that was the thing about The Fatal Shore. That's the thing also about Barcelona, his other big book. But I want to talk about Fatal Shore first. I don't know if you read it actually, Benway.
Yeah, I've read it. I mean, well, let me put it, I've read large segments of it. So it actually comes later in his career. So it's from 1986, and he was already well established with a lot of things. But Fatal Shore is specifically, it's a history of Australia, but specifically the founding and specifically the convict transportation system.
Mm-hmm.
And that level of it's a narrative. And remember, with this guy, as you look into his background, the man certainly he's not the type of guy who was into art, wanted to be an artist, and then failing that became a critic. No, he was always a writer. In fact, the earliest footage I've ever seen of him is from the late 50s, where he's talking about the legitimacy of certain beat poets and writers as opposed to other beat poets and writers. So this man was very literally motivated to begin with. And it's unsurprising to me that The Fatal Shore adopts that narrative element to it, but also, given that it's about Australia, certainly has something of a, though it's history, self-referential aspect to it.
Yeah. The thing about Hughes is, how could I put it? There aren't critics like him, like big personality. I think that's what struck me the most. And you can see it in the other thing that we will be talking about, which is The Shock of the New. This was a TV series that he did for the BBC later on. What was it, in the 90s, I think? I forget.
So The Shock of the New was in the early 80s. It came out in like 80, 81, I think.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah. 80, 81. For some reason, I thought it would come out in the 90s.
Because he did a follow-up to it in 2004, actually, called The New Shock of the New, which is, like I had said before, the Shock of the New, that's his 9 or 8 part, I don't know how many part, documentary on modernism, all the various aspects of it, from painting to architecture, sculpture, you name it, he covered it. And you got a sense from that documentary is that he recognizes, I missed this big, blast of expression, but I'm old enough to kind of recognize the bits of it that were flailing about. And when he was young, he comes back in 2004 and he's seeing what was left in what's left in the remnants of this creative explosion. And the answer was not much.
Yeah, that one I have a hazier memory of. I have a sharp memory of the second one. because I remember him because he's an old man and he was clearly not in the best of shape physically. He would later he had a very bad car accident, I believe, in the late 90s or something like that.
That's
And
right.
yeah, for the follow up to Shock of the New, that the new Shock of the New, I guess it was called. Yeah, he was what you call it. He was infirm. Clearly, he was not in the best of shape, but still, that personality, that big lion-like personality, shone through. And I think that that's the thing that struck me the most about Robert Hughes, that he had such a big personality, and it came through in his writing. I remember reading him in Time magazine when I was a teenager, because that was the magazine that we got at home. And I remember, like, whenever I read an article of his, it was like big. It was like it stood out. There was something about the energy of his writing, or something, even though he was talking about things that at the time I knew nothing about or less understood. But I got this sense that he was like big, like a big force, like a lion. And when I actually got to see him on video, of course, I never met the man. I was sort of unsurprised. I was like, yeah, this is the man who would write those columns in Time magazine that were so definitive about what they liked and not. And what so it's sort of like, how can I put this? The thing about Robert Hughes that I find interesting is that he was a critic with a point of view, and there doesn't seem to be much of that around anymore. You see what I'm saying? I mean, we're talking about Robert Hughes, but I wanted to expand a little bit the conversation beyond just Robert Hughes. But there aren't that many critics. I don't know if it's a product of the age or just a product of that critics in general tend to be more like, the peanut gallery people. But
Well, the standards of judgment have evolved into a standard which is not judgmental. By that, I mean that the critical attitudes you will get, be it, well, frankly, anywhere, to a certain extent, are, kind of politically, finding the means of politically approving popular culture. So, oh, this is sufficiently woke, it's good. Oh, this is sufficiently representative, ergo I like it. What's missing there is the history, and the trajectory of the civilization, which leads to this point. What Hughes was, he had a great line in this interview. I think it was with Charlie Rose, back when Charlie Rose was, the interviewer that everybody would pay attention to. He had a line, something to the effect of, a music critic. I mean, he's talking contemporary music. A music critic who doesn't deal with Beethoven is illiterate, just in the same way a book critic would be illiterate if he had no idea what to say about Charles Dickens. That was kind of his attitude. And you saw it with everything that he kind of did. Even in the contemporary art, a lot of it which he trashed, and other bits of it he actually, and they were rarer to find, but he would celebrate people. It was fully aware of what was going on. So I always loved, I do want to get into like the contemporary artists of his time, say the 80s, that he completely demolished. But he wasn't like a stodgy guy either. Like, he was a very strong champion of the comic book artist R. Crumb. And you even see him in the documentary Crumb talking about this. And he's well aware, in his celebration of Crumb, he will say, like, look, this is part of the comic tradition you'll see in Goya. And Goya is one of the key influences on Hughes's life, I guess, if you want to say it that way. So he knew all of that. And that was the necessary piece to have with his judgment. You don't really have that anymore, partly because nobody's trained to know all of these things. And two, if they are trained to be aware of this past, it's mostly to criticize it, in the sense that, oh, well, it wasn't representative of today.
yeah, it wasn't multicultural enough. Yeah. I guess that's the issue, because I think of him and I put him in the same category as Roger Ebert, although Hughes was a better writer. Although Roger Ebert was not a bad writer by any stretch of the imagination, but big personalities that had clear viewpoints on the art that they were criticizing, and who understood the art but had no desire to participate in the art. Okay, Because okay, Roger Ebert did write a script for some godforsaken horrible
Oh
movie.
no, it wasn't even not a. It was actually a wonderfully cheesy movie. It was the sequel to The Valley of the Dolls called Beyond the Valley of the
Yeah.
Dolls, and it's a Russ Myers movie. Russ Myers
Right.
being it's a really not even
Softcore.
softcore porn. That was even too harsh what he said. But his famous line was, "I like big bosoms and square jaws," and like this is what Roger Ebert did. But no. To be fair, I mean, you're asking a question about critical personalities. And when did these personalities stop? Because film criticism was loaded with them as well. You had, obviously Roger Ebert, but Pauline Kael,
Right.
and go down the list. I won't bore you with names that you may or may not remember, but music critics, you could get people like that. And Robert Hughes was the art critic. So what changed? Well, that was the last generation or two. Let's say that just before World War II, and then the baby boomers, the last generation that
had standards.
Number one was educated in what preceded itself, but two had a certain at least vestiges of self-confidence. But they were also the generation and the kind of few generations that preceded them that kind of realized that they didn't really have much to bequeath to other people, right? So if there's anything that's important, I think, with a critic, I think it's carrying on a tradition and the knowledge of saying, look, I'm exhibiting these standards, and in exhibiting them, I'm giving you all the knowledge of what preceded it. Here's the tools you have. Go forth and use these standards of judgment, to advance everything. And I felt like these guys, and I won't put, Hughes in that bucket, and I won't put Ebert in that bucket, but I would say like the kind of milieu around them. I think that group just kind of lost confidence at a certain point to say, like, oh, who can say what judgment is anyway? What kind of preconceived social notions am I bringing in that are ruining things? You know what I mean?
Pathetic.
But I mean, it's pathetic. But the unfortunate reality the unfortunate matter is that it is the reality, right? I mean, that is the crusty remnants of the lack of critical faculties, right? And that's why I liked Robert Hughes so much, because he was so harsh on people who sucked and deserved it. My favorite is he broke Julian Schnabel's brain. Now, for those of you kids who are too young to know, there was this period of time called the 80s. And in the 80s, per usual, right, with the influx of a lot of money and kind of like the growth in conspicuous consumption, that old notion that like one of the signs of the upper classes is how much money they can throw away on like stupid shit. Well, art collecting became one of the big brouhahas in the 80s, not the least of which because you could make a lot of money off of it. And there was schmucks like a guy like Julian Schnabel, who, if you look at his paintings, they're basically grease glands, on canvas with some broken plates in them. Very bad drawing capabilities, rough ideas. If he's that kind of aesthetic.
He's a marketer.
He was a very strong marketer. He's known now for like directing shitty movies.
No, they're not that bad.
TBD. But basically, he was the embodiment of this kind of artist, and Hughes just would not have any of it. He basically compared him. He said he was this, he was to painting what Stallone was to acting, like a lot of overly oiled muscles and little, technique to show for it. That's perhaps a little bit judgmental of Stallone, but it was pretty accurate of Schnabel. And you could tell that this never exited Schnabel's brain, because I remember a 60 Minutes interview they did with Schnabel where they actually brought up Robert Hughes and said he was not a fan of your work. And all they said was he wasn't a fan of your work. What do you have to say about that? And Schnabel was so like defensive. He's like, he's just a bully, man. He's mean and everything. How dare you bring this up? And then it was Morley Safer doing the interview.
Oh,
so Morley Safer goes on.
He's a softball.
So Morley changes the subject and says, okay, well, like, let's get to the fact that you decided to direct movies and this, that, and the other. And Schnabel's just like stone faced for a while, and he finally responds, I'm still pissed off about the Robert Hughes thing. And he's trying to pretend after saying these things that I don't think about Robert Hughes a lot. I just think it's lazy on your part. Like, it's the only thing you think about, Julian. It literally broke his brain. And well, why did I go through that long diatribe about that story? Well, because it's going to be outside of like internet people like us who will fling shit when we need to. you're not going to find too many critics who will pour on that kind of vitriol for aesthetic reasons. You will find people who pour on vitriol for political reasons or for, showmanship reasons, like, oh, let me show you how woke I am by noting the fact that a white guy made this shit and that's bad.
Yeah.
That's the vitriol you'll get today. But you won't get someone saying you literally don't know technique. You literally don't know what the fuck you're doing, because that to presume knowledge of history and technique somehow in this current world is to presume prejudice. Well, obviously it is prejudicial to a certain extent, but prejudicial based on things that the society wants to do away with, namely old men like Robert Hughes.
Because he didn't fuck around. And look, the critical faculty, the job of the critic, of course, is that he is measuring the work, because presumably he's studied enough that he has a body of work internalized, and he is comparing and contrasting new work to that work that he already has inside him, if you will. And what happens, of course, is that, it depends, of course, what you have internalized and the quality of what you have internalized. Now, I'm firmly of the belief that there is art that is better than other art. You show me two movies and I can say this movie is better than the other. Sometimes it's like almost impossible to tell which movie is better because they're just radically different. And that's why it's so frustrating and so much fun. Sometimes at the Academy Awards when they actually have a good year and you're comparing and contrasting movies, you're just like, oh, this was better than that one. It's a fool's game, but it's a fun game, right? But you can tell the difference between something like Return of the Valley of the Dolls contrasted to The Godfather, just for the sake of argument. One is better than the other, no question. If you internalize shitty movies, shitty books, shitty art, I have the following question. If you internalize the shitty crap, will you, when you come across something good, will you realize it's good, or will you think that the shitty stuff is better?
Well, that's an interesting question. And it's hard to kind of answer that because... Well,
sorry. Let me just add something parenthetically so that you understand what I'm saying. See, we agree that current critics are these fucking losers, right? And they have internalized a lot of shitty art that they claim is good, but I think it's garbage. Like, for instance, in books, right? Everybody thinks that Tim O'Brien and the things they carried is like the greatest war collection of war stories ever. And I think it's kind of crappy, to tell you the truth. And I've read enough war stories to know it's kind of shitty, but the current crop thinks that that's good. So my question is, will critics who have a bad inner store warehouse of books, when they come to something good, will they fail to recognize that it's good?
I mean, it's entirely possible. I mean, and to kind of stick with Robert Hughes as a kind of give it like real life examples to work through here. Mm-hmm. Like in that, if it wasn't in, I forget which series it was either in the New Shock of the New or American Visions. Yeah. He kind of went to it's those contemporary art exhibits that are primarily a product of identity, right? They're literally agitprop of things like, an installation that's, like a bloody tampon and a neon sign that says there's insufficient funding for AIDS. And Robert Hughes's point was, that could very well, let's for the sake of argument say everything you're trying to articulate in the piece is true, but the question remains, so what? Frankly, because he says it's the equivalent of saying you drew some mermaids, right? Mm-hmm. You just for the sake of drawing mermaids. Well, it's the same basic idea. You're representing a kind of thought or thing that you want to depict, but what's the point? What is your level of sincere engagement there? And the reason I bring that up is because I think when you say like, oh, if someone gets so used to praising hollow works, and when they come across something great, how do they respond to it? Well, I think that's the kind of example, because when you're trained in, or at least you turn off that bit of your brain that asks the question, so what? Well, the so what means that there is no difference, between someone who, let's say, like the brothers Karamazov versus, Harry Potter, right? Mm-hmm. You're just simply saying, oh, I enjoyed, the romp of this, but, Brothers Karamazov is just so hard. It's long and all these things. What it lacks is a sense of, what are you engaging with? What is the kind of thrust of the emotional or effort that the artist is putting in? That I think is the bit that's the critical missing part. And it's the bit that necessitates awareness, knowledge of kind of what preceded it, or, where are you coming from there? And I know I'm kind of on shaky ground there, because I also have the sentiment of saying you shouldn't feel dependent on what an artist has to say about his work. So it's always tricky ground, but I think that's kind of the crux of it. If you fail to recognize, or if you just, by virtue of your standards of judgment, fail to engage with or recognize the art that is around the bit you're looking at, and also the art that was not made as a result of this thing, you're kind of at a loss. It's just like, I like green versus blue. You know what I mean?
I'm not sure. Well, here's my thinking is that I tend to think that if your diet does affect your outlook. If you're used to eating potato chips, you're not going to know that escargot is actually good. It seems to me that so many of the critics today they imbue so much crap and so much agitprop that when they see something actually good, they can't recognize it, and I think that that's a serious problem. Um, Not that it isn't objectively better. It's that they don't recognize it. They don't have the tools to realize it. Because if they've been, hammered with the agitprop, it's sort of like Soviet critics, like Soviet editors and such, that they were so used to doing, new socialist realism shit, right? That they couldn't appreciate art that wasn't that, and they sometimes they allowed it because they didn't even see it. Okay, and that's why you have like so many movies that are sort of like groundbreaking, but the censors, the apparatchiki who were in charge of allowing the art, they didn't recognize it. They were blind to it. You see what I'm saying? And I'm wondering if modern critics, because so many of them have been raised on agitprop taught to them in colleges, are just not going to be able to recognize what's good. And if editors at publishing houses, are not going to publish books because they can't see that they're any good. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I think part of also what's going on here is that a lot of critics, editors, whatnot of today, maybe a lot of them have always been this way, but certainly today, they're too within the world to judge the world. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So when you're in this setting, you believe in all of this agitprop and whatnot. You're just literally locked in. You engage. You drink too much of the Kool-Aid. You don't really see the mechanics of what's going on. When you take someone who's kind of exists mentally, half exists in the present, half exists in the past, or you take someone who's literally was an outsider. It was not an accident that I had mentioned Robert Hughes's past.
Yeah.
That he came from Sydney. He was outside of the walled city, as it were. When you have that mindset and you are trained almost, if not monastically, in that scholastic tradition of, you see the world from outside of the world. Well, then you're in a position to say, I can see the progress moving from here to there. I see what goes up, what goes down. And you're able to realize that in your critiques, not just of things that you like, but things that you don't like, you're recognizing the mechanics that are creating it. You're recognizing the fact that you will get always, when you are reading or watching Robert Hughes, that the art is a manifestation of the psychology and aspirations and all of that jazz of the society around it. This is actually one of the little nuggets that postmodernism did try to acknowledge. Is like there's a lot more to it that you can kind of see if you're a little bit outside of it. But I think just too many people are just wrapped up in the motions of the oceans today. They don't really step outside and see that. And he did. And I give him immense credit for that. Yeah, and I think that's also a missing part. And it's why I had mentioned, it was when we were doing that live stream with, Black Pigeon Speaks, that one of the reasons I said, I like Murdoch so much. Little did you know that I would blend Murdoch, and Robert Hughes, but here we are. Part of the
I
reason
think
I
Robert
like
Hughes
them,
would have liked Murdoch. By the way,
in a twisted way, I think he would have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why the reason I bring him up? Murdoch could only be as funny as it is. Could only do that humor if they were outsiders. You know,
Yeah.
insiders of culture today, Hollywood, New York publishing, pick your poison. They would have been too wrapped into themselves, into the world at large, and all of that things to really be, critical of what's going on, and also critical of themselves. When you have outsiders like that, there's just you're not fettered to anything. There's the lack of obligations. And the interesting thing about Hughes, and I guess that's why him sitting at the perch of Times Magazine is so interesting. He's an outsider who sits on an organ of mass cultural communication, and he can then dispense his judgments. And I think that was a nice little thing that he probably relished. You know what I mean? He could have easily been an academic. Probably he certainly had that talent, but he didn't. He became something a little bit more substantial, I'd say.
Definitely much more substantial in my estimation.
And the other thing I want to stress about him, and this is the pitfall I always worry about when I say, when someone says, getting used to bad art, and if you're too comfortable with it, what I want to stress with that, to me, the bad art doesn't necessarily have to be a genre specific or even a medium specific issue. Robert Hughes, still going on Robert Hughes. If you see a lot of his documentaries, he loved like the 50s design of American cars, the industrialism of it, and the fact that it was inefficient, and it was aghast of the sensibilities of the, some of the more the European kind of more modernist inspired artists, and they were just so utterly appalled by that. He loved that. I mentioned his love of R. Crumb. That's literally comic books. He appreciated good stuff coming out of that. It wasn't a stodginess of him that says, look, there are, good art can only be found in these types of museums, or good literature found in these bookstores. No. It could be found elsewhere. But the judgment of why it was good remained strong. And you always got a sense from him, what was his judgment? It's like, well, is the artist honestly engaging with some sort of issue, or confronting some sort of issue? It's the difference between like art and kitsch. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if you ever thought about that, or if you use the term. I mean, I'm sure everybody uses the term kitsch, but I don't think we tend to think about what it means, right? And the way I always think about it is like kitsch is always, it's like it's a representation of a certain artistic expression, but without awareness or care or concern of why it was the way it was. Think, for example, of like, Koons, who, was another artist that Hughes mercilessly mocked. Koons was a guy also came out of the 80s. I think he was a banker.
Yeah.
Initially, and then he decided to be an artist. And he actually has no knowledge of technique. He doesn't even build the art pieces himself. He conceptualizes them, has other people do them.
Yeah.
And they're so ridiculous. It's like a porcelain statue of Michael Jackson with the fucking monkey.
Yeah.
Or that was also from one of the Hughes documentaries where he literally is mocking Koons to his face, where he goes to Koons' studio and there's this big statue of a kitten in a sock, like, massive size. Let's say it's like 2.5 stories tall. And, he says, Hughes says, what is this? And the guy says, well, I think it's my take on a sort of religious crucifixion type, image. And Hughes is like, where the fuck do you get that idea? He says, well, he tries, Koons starts to explain it in a jibber jabber kind of way. And Hughes just says, you're literally just like a happy, cheery kitten in a fucking sock. And what was Hughes's point behind that? His point was there was no seriousness in this. There was no effort to engage something, and which isn't to say you could also be comic, right? But you can be seriously comic. This was just, what's the next batch of money I can grab? And that was the other kind of bit of what Hughes was recognizing, especially in the second half of his career, which was, I'm in the world of money and art as a business as opposed to art as expression.
Yeah. Well, the thing that's interesting about his background is that he was once at once part of the establishment of Australia. He came from a fairly well-to-do family who various members of his family wound up in relatively good positions in Australian society. And yet, at the same time, he was from Australia, which back then in the day was considered the boonies. And
Hmm.
what I find interesting, oh, and by the way, have you realized that he was a contemporary of the Bee Gees? He must have known them, you
Well, I'm
know?
sure he did. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
absolutely sure he did.
Which is kind of amusing, Robert Hughes and the Bee Gees partying down.
Well, it's funny. There's like a lot of, especially for that generation, there's other weirdness. The other great example is um, Coppola and Jim Morrison and guys from The Doors were classmates at film school together.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
there was a whole bunch of just weird shit like that going around.
oh
Anyway, sorry
that's
for the tangent, but that was the immediate thought that came to mind.
yeah, yeah. No problem. But the thing that I'm noticing as we're talking here, I'm looking at his works, and they're all out of print, especially the ones that matter the most, like The Shock of the New and what you call this book, The Culture of Complaint, which just it's kind of surprising because it's so on point to what's going on today. I mean, I'm as we're talking, I'm ordering them, right? And by the way, I'll be ordering them before this podcast comes out, so I'll be getting the few remaining copies because it's just absurd. It's out of print, and
Well, it's a short-term memory loss, right? Of culture today. I don't know that I have a good theory behind it, but I'm always shocked at how much good stuff is forgotten. A lot of the books I kind of get now are used books that are kind of like that, which were, oh, this guy was very interesting, and I hear about someone talking about him, and oh, can I find the new books? No, or books that like just new editions of the books? No. So I go back to the to the third party sellers, and I'll usually find them ungodly cheap, in a lot of instances. And yeah, I mean, this is one. I mean, I suspect, there will be reprintings eventually. But the good thing about the Shock of the New is even if you can't get the book,
the
all of the
documentary,
episodes are
yeah.
online. All the documentary episodes are online. And I really loved that documentary because it weds so well to an earlier similar kind of documentary, which is Civilization by Lord Kenneth Clark.
Hmm.
And I think it was they were conscientiously aware that they were similar. So some of you may recall that Civilization by Ken Clark has the position of Ken Clark doing a survey of art history, but it was Western European or Western Central European art civilization from, let's say, the Middle Ages through contemporary time. And the perspective he had there was a very conservative, like this is the culture surviving, growing, and overcoming obstacles. And when Hughes comes along and does his, people were like, "Oh, I don't know if you could do Kenneth Clark all over again." Well, he does, but he does it differently. It's very much similar style, but it's more of like this period of time fucked up a lot of people, and let me show you what came about as a result of it. So it's very similar, but it's much more concentrated. He's going through like 100 years at most, right? Whereas Clark went through 1,000.
Hmm. Well, look, to go in a different direction. The thing about Robert Hughes that I liked very much was, see, when I was growing up, I didn't like consult him or read him religiously, but I always knew that there was a guy who could sort of like be my Virgil through the world of art. Now, of course, his written works remain, though the man is gone. And so that sense remains that there is a critic whose judgment I can trust to give me the real scoop on whatever whatever artist, whatever work is around that other people are considering phenomenal or awful, and he'll give me like he'll be my Virgil, Virgil in the Dante sense, right? Um, Insofar as movies are concerned, it happens to me with Roger Ebert. Roger Ebert saw everything and wrote about everything. And so often as not, I'll find myself going to his website and looking at some old column that he wrote 30, 40 years ago and check up on what he thought about a particular movie. and that'll be my guiding appreciation of that movie. And I'll watch it, and later I'll be able to say, "Yeah, Roger, you were on point," or "Roger, you're totally wrong, and you're wrong for this, and that reason." But the point is, see, a critic, a good critic, is supposed to be that Virgil. He's supposed to be that guide through the landscape of a particular art form, and tell you, be careful with this. This is crappy, and look at that. That's really good. And I trust his judgment. And when I disagree with his judgment, because he's so at once sincere, knowledgeable, forthright, and with great points for his arguments, I better be fucking prepared. If I disagree with him, I better know exactly why I disagree with him, and not just like, I just don't think you're right. I don't feel it. No, no, no. I have to be, because his discipline, the great critic's discipline, the great critic's erudition, and his systematic analysis of a work forces you as a viewer, using him as a guide, to confront him sometimes even more than the artist. Because a great critic sometimes it's a form of art. He has a certain opinion on a piece of art, and you have to measure your opinion against his. And that's a delightful experience, because it's like you're talking to an older, wiser man, and sometimes agreeing with him, sometimes disagreeing with him, but each time it's forcing you to think. And that is something I appreciate about Robert Hughes and Roger Ebert. And I don't see any critic around in frankly in any field that I feel the same way about. You know what I mean?
So what was interesting, I like the two critics you mentioned as well. Obviously, we're discussing one, well, both actually. But what I find I enjoy about critics like that is honestly less the ultimate conclusion of their judgment, but more the fact that they made a judgment and the process behind which that judgment was made.
Sure.
So, what I liked reading with Roger Ebert, I liked it with Pauline Kael, I liked it with James Agee, I liked it with Leslie Fiedler, go through the list. I like it with Robert Hughes. Is yes, there's a mechanical system, or not just mechanical, but like an interesting sequence of thought giving to why the experience they felt encountering a piece of art was unique, worthwhile, or not so worthwhile. And usually, in the result of those conversations, a few things happen. One, if I'm especially when I'm in agreement with them, there's a kind of reverie of shared understanding of the world, which produces a lot of, frankly, excitement. There's fun time. You have fun time sometimes reading critics that you like in that kind of way. Two, what often happens is, to your point of the Virgil, they will bring forth with them comparison points to justify their arguments, and it will sometimes be things you didn't know about, and your knowledge will expand as a result of that. It's a communion of like-minded individuals and recipient of the of the artwork and the history behind it. That's what's so great about it. And to your question, are there many critics who do that now? Some do, some don't, most not so well. One critic I actually think does very well, and it's the one that everybody seems to make fun of because they don't understand him. It's Armond White. He's the film critic for National Review. Mm-hmm. He's a black guy, but very conservative, and he tends to take contrarian opinions. But people think, oh, he's just being a troll. Well, not really. He's articulating a point of view in discussing films, usually from a moral perspective, and not in a kind of stodgy way, but certainly someone who takes a film who proposes to present some sort of moral argument or facsimile thereof. He says, okay, you want to play that game? I'm going to play that game, and I'm going to hold you to very high standards on that, and I'm going to engage you on that level. And if I think you're a farce and a lie, I will say so. And he does that. And that is the reason why he will say things like, the frippery of the Marvel movies may be more entertaining, but when they play their kind of vision of the world and how one should act, there's, something abysmal, if not nihilistic to them. Whereas, ironically enough, even though they're probably worse movies, the DC movies at least have some pretense of an actual moral code that actually is based in something. You can critique his conclusions on those movies all you want, but that level of engagement is what's interesting. And that's the point of the good critics. And that's what Robert Hughes always did.
Yeah, exactly. Because engagement and it forcing you to engage. And that's the thing, because I want to be engaged with art. but I want to know which art to watch, to pay attention to. You know, I have ceased paying attention to modern novels because they seem all like crap to me. I just don't bother reading anything contemporary. Why would I? Because some of it is just, there's a novel that is on my list called Milkman. It was the winner of the Man Booker Prize, right? And on Amazon, I started reading the first couple of pages, and it was just like, ugh, it's just like more agitprop shit, right? The big bad man and the poor delicate sunflower of a girl, and rape and power and patriarchy and shit. And I'm sick of that crap. Okay, I'm sick of it because it's just not. It's not real. It's not art that expresses humanity. Or the reality of human existence. Because modernism, sure, is sometimes it's very abstract, but it is expressing something human. Whereas a lot of this agitprop is just agitprop. It's just trying to convince me of a point of view about reality that isn't real, that isn't true. And I'm sick of it. And so the thing is, see, I wish there were a critic today in the contemporary novel scene who would be like Robert Hughes and say, most of this is shit, okay? But here are a couple of nuggets of something worthwhile, But there isn't that. And unfortunately, it seems to me in novels, especially as of the last 30-odd years, really, 30 to 50 years practically, we've slowly had this encroachment of this agitprop that, the literary landscape is bereft, and it's very, very depressing to me. I wish there were a critic who could help me.
Well, here's how I would articulate that. One of the things you will find when you really enjoy art or a work of art in general, in whatever medium, in addition to just watching it and experience, what's the next best thing, if not a slightly better thing? Talking about it with someone who is on your wavelength,
right?
Who will even if you are in disagreement, will kind of bat around the ideas and kind of continue the reverie of the experience of engaging this art. A lot of these critics do that by proxy, whereas in a lot of instances you may only have a certain amount of time with your friends and we have a point of view. You may want to extend that, usually with a critic, and the critic, as we said before, will have extra knowledge to do that. I think what's at a loss now, and the problem that I'm trying to wrap my head around, is why don't a lot of contemporary critics instill that sense of, joyful discussion, right? And the best answer I can come up with right now, and I'm not pretending it's the full answer, is that there is a lack of joy, it seems to me, in a lot of critics. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, online. I mean, sure. Like some online reviewers, I will enjoy when they get going on stuff. I can get excited. Not too many of them, but a lot of the professional critic writers, don't seem to really have their heart in it in a weird way. Like, I'll give you an example. And she's not an example of a contemporary critic, although she's still writing. Michiko Kakutani. She was always known as the ball buster of the New York Times review of book, or not review of books, but the New York Times book reviewer.
Yeah.
And everybody always said that she was kind of a cunt, and
probably
it would be, and it was. It's one thing is like Pauline Kael was called a cunt, but Pauline Kael actually enjoyed movies. When I read Michiko Kakutani, I never got a sense that whether she enjoyed books or not, she was kind of sharing that enjoyment with me. It always felt like a school marm bitch.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the situation we're in. I think there's a lot of school marm bitchery at play.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of, let me recognize when someone's woke or not woke, when someone's being slightly racist or not. That's school marmery.
Yeah.
That's the hall monitor, doing that. There is no reverie. There's no enjoyment that's being shared. And I think that may be the gap.
That there is no enjoyment.
Yeah, I don't think it's hard. Like, well, think about it. Even a critic you disagree with, are you really getting a sense of joy anymore? Like, I used to read A.O. Scott. I mean, I don't anymore. I mean, because I never felt there was much coming out of him. Dana Stevens, who writes for Slate.
I got really disappointed in A.O. Scott because I started reading his book, Nothing But Critical, I think it's called, and I thought it was just such slop, just slop. I felt this visceral disgust with it, and I rent and returned it. That's a rare thing for me because usually even books I don't like, I keep them. But that was one book that I went and returned. That's how the visceral yeah. And then I started looking at his stuff, and I realized that probably the nothing if not critical is his actual point of view, and probably his editors had really toned back his it wasn't pretentiousness, it was smugness. It was just a smug ugh.
Yeah.
And yeah, he looks down on his art, you know. He doesn't like it.
Yeah, I mean, David,
he likes it, but in a smug way, in a supercilious way. Ugh.
And a lot of the New York critics are like that. David Denby is like that. Manola Dargis, I think, is pretty much like that now. Anthony Lane, I think, is probably better, but I haven't read him since I gave up my New Yorker subscription, so I don't know if he's worth it anymore. But a lot of that said, the New York-based critics are very much, they condescend a lot, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that points to something important. See, the New York people, I've seen this across the media, not just in books and movies, but in just about every media. New York people are full of shit. They're arrogant and they look down on everybody. And they even find a sort of like a kind of contempt for the things that they're supposed to specialize in, like movies or books or what have you, right? And the books that they publish or promote, I mean, I know about publishing, and the books that they find important are ideological, and it's just so depressing. It's not really good writing. It's not good literature. I know that a lot of the critics, especially the ones based in New York, in Slate and Salon and what have you, they like Handmaid's Tale because of the political point, not because it's a good TV show or not. And apparently it's not even a very good TV show. I haven't watched it myself, but it seems to be like sort of like ideologically driven. I'll watch it, just to get a sense of it. The original novel was ideologically driven, and I thought it was stupid. I mean, I thought it was just flat out stupid when I read it years ago. And so it's like all ideology. An ideology as opposed to the actual work. They do not respect the work or the artist or the art form. It's all to the degree that it helps their ideology. That's what it seems like to me. And that's why it's so refreshing to read somebody like Robert Hughes, like Roger Ebert. They cared about the art. They respected the artist. Sometimes they would berate the artist because they felt that the artist could do better, Yeah,
well, then that's what you want to do. You want to hold them up to the standards. What's interesting also with Hughes is Hughes was arguably just as much a New York fixture as a lot of those other guys, but he never felt like a New Yorker.
Right.
I think you understand what I meant by that.
Yeah.
Like he never came across as provincially of New York. In fact, if you look at a lot of his art criticisms, he certainly was critical of a lot of the shit coming out of New York. But when he goes around, this is a guy who knew a lot, traveled around a lot in the United States and the world to talk about his, criticisms, his documentaries. You never got a sense that like, oh, I'm in the podunk part of Iowa just so I could talk a little bit about Grant Wood. It's like, no, he was excited. He was interested because there was something interesting here.
Yeah.
He was. That was an example of.
He didn't condescend.
That's an example of rootless cosmopolitanism that is not a pain in the ass like a lot of our crowd does. Actually, he recognized the regional artists and what they were doing and why it was interesting, why it was important.
Yeah,
he understood that. And again, and I come back to this theme, but I think it's a real theme that we have to appreciate. And I think a lot of people in our audience would recognize it too. It's like being that a kind of outsider sometimes helps on these critical judgments. A lot,
yeah.
And why I say it to our crowd, look, our crowd, we have to recognize it, and I recognize it in myself. By virtue of our opinions, of our recognition that something's wrong, we're inherently outsiderish people at this point in time. Relish the fact that because of that, you can have a set standard of judgment that other people around you just will not or could not have. And Robert Hughes exhibited that.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. To tell you the truth, I can't top that comment, and so with that, I think we'll wind down this podcast. This has been the Coach and Benway Show. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time. Take it easy.
And watch some Robert Hughes documentaries.
Oh yes, watch Robert Hughes documentaries.